Okay. Hi, everybody. My name's Mikulyuk, and I think we're about ready to get started. Is that true?
Yep. Yeah. Can you hear me, Allie?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. So I'm assuming that means everyone else can hear me. I'm here with Tim Campbell, and this is Jenny Siebert, and we're happy to host Allie Mikulyuk for this webinar today. And I don't want to take up Allie's airtime, so I'm just going to hand the mic right over to her.
All right. Thank you, Jenny, and thanks for everybody for tuning in here. I'm excited to share some work that we've done today on smart prevention for Eurasian water milfoil. In particular, I'd like to first acknowledge my co-authors. Catherine Hein works in the monitoring section at the Wisconsin DNR. Ellen Kuyava is out of the Lake Champlain Basin now in Vermont, and Jake van der Zanden, a limnology professor at the University of Wisconsin. So just to sort of start off here, the topic that we're discussing is Eurasian water milfoil, and effective application of our limited management resources to preventing and managing this species requires an understanding of which systems are most vulnerable to invasion. I'm really excited to share with you some of the recent progress that we've made in understanding lake-specific invasion vulnerability for this species. The purpose of the presentation today is twofold. First, it's an information dump. I'd like to share the stuff that we're working on now and the new information that the work that we've done has generated. And second, I'm really interested in getting your feedback, both in terms of whether or not you find this information useful and how you might use it, as well as how you'd like to interact with the information that we're presenting here. So I'm looking forward to designing a web-based tool that will allow our work here to influence management and prevention. So, brief outline. I'm going to touch a little bit on EWM status in the state of Wisconsin and talk a little bit about the ecological and social impact of the species. But most of the talk is going to be concerned with understanding this idea of lake-specific vulnerability. And vulnerability has a couple of parts that we'll go into in detail, and then talk about the research that we've done to better understand the two components of vulnerability, one being the occurrence of Eurasian water milfoil in this case, that is where it occurs in the landscape, as well as the abundance. When it's invaded a lake, how much of it is likely to be there, for example. And then we'll probably try to use about, I'm getting a little bit of clicking happening. Okay, good. And then I'd like to talk, maybe 20, even 30 minutes, discuss sort of your ideas and feedback and get some information on tool design. So first, EWM status in Wisconsin. It's in about 7% of the lakes that we have in this state that are over 2.5 acres. On average, the littoral cover is around 20%. And so of the over 2.5 acre lakes, that means that 8,630 don't yet have EWM. And some of the work that the Wisconsin DNR has done to understand the way that the species is being spread across the landscape is showing us that the invasion rate in new systems is remaining steady. It's not increasing. So we still have a lot of area that we could consider for prevention. Ecological effects of the species, and I'd kind of like to plug a blog article that Jenny Siebert just authored recently. You may have received communication about this morning. Our understanding of the effects and the impacts of Eurasian water milfoil has evolved markedly over the past 5 years. In general, we have a body of literature that points to Eurasian water milfoil's ability to outcompete native plants, for example, or impact trophic diversity or affect macroinvertebrate populations. And then we have another set of information when, sort of like looking on the broad scale, finds less evidence for adverse impacts across the board. So understanding impact is a complicated thing, and when we break down the studies that report impact differently, often we find that when we look at the scale within lakes or at small sample sizes targeting areas with large invasive populations, That's when we tend to find the major adverse impacts. But when we look at the scale of landscapes, that evidence isn't there. In part, that might be due to this graph here is showing our abundance distribution of Eurasian water milfoil, and this is in the state of Wisconsin. And so you see around the 10% maximum bin here, so from 0 to 10, the vast majority of systems that we've studied have very low abundances, while only a few systems have very high abundances. So because abundance is usually low, that might explain why when we look at landscapes, we're not seeing major impacts. For example, a Trebitz and Taylor study in the Great Lakes Basin in wetlands, they found in 2007 that Eurasian water milfoil, they would characterize it more as a matrix dominant, capable of coexisting with other species with no negative impacts on native cover. In some work that we've done recently, we've tried to compare the ecological effect of Eurasian water milfoil on other macrophytes to the ecological effect of whole lake herbicide treatments. And basically kind of think of these coefficients that come out of the model as describing, a positive effect that's, increasingly positive and increasingly negative. And when we look at the distribution of these species-specific responses, so each number is a macrophyte species, we see that the density of plots with respect to the EWM axis is actually sort of on the top part of this graph. So in fact, most species tend to increase with Eurasian water milfoil, as opposed to with respect to the treatment axis, we see a lot of negative effects of, this is whole lake herbicide treatment. So this, taken with some other landscape scale studies, is sort of pointing to the fact that EWM may be more responding to environmental factors than necessarily engineering macrophyte communities. However, it has demonstrated socioeconomic effects. The species does, even if it's capable of coexisting with natives most of the time, it has a kind of an annoying growth form. It grows right up to the surface and along the top of the water in situations where moderate water clarity happens, and that can cause navigational nightmares and interfere with recreation. It's definitely a nuisance. And some work has pointed to the fact that just having Eurasian water milfoil on a lake can reduce property values, from somewhere, I think, between 13 and 19%. There was a study in Washington and a study in Wisconsin that showed that. So that said, there's broad support for prevention and control for the species because it does have negative impacts. And maybe as a result of these negative impacts, permit requests are increasing in the state of Wisconsin. So people are clamoring to do something about this species. So when we look at the landscape scale studies where we're seeing most lakes don't have huge populations of Eurasian water milfoil, and so therefore maybe the ecological effects writ large are not enormous. The spatial scale at which that research is conducted doesn't necessarily translate to the spatial scale on which management decisions are typically made. So the scale of research finding, applies to the entire state of Wisconsin, where we can say Eurasian water milfoil is usually rare, but that doesn't help an individual riparian or a lake manager looking at an individual system. Riparians ask the question, but is my lake at risk? Am I, one of these red bars? Do we need to preventatively monitor this lake? It doesn't have it yet, but is it likely to have it in the future? And if it gets here, this is a question I hear almost all the time, will it be a problem? National resource professionals are faced with a different series of questions, faced with a large number of lakes. In Wisconsin, there's 16,000, I think. We have 9,000 over 2.5 hectares. The question becomes, I have limited monitoring resources, where should I put them? Or following invasion, should our response emphasize active management or passive observation? So because management and prevention resources are quite limited, ideally, we would be able to allocate prevention and management actions to the systems that have the highest chance of experiencing an invasion and are also likely to sustain adverse effects because of that invasion. Saying that in other words, you'd simply want to prioritize vulnerable lakes. And site-specific or lake-specific vulnerability can be understood as operating through a series of filters. So first, we need to pass the introduction filter in terms of answering the question, which sites will be colonized. Those that will be colonized then, if they are suitable, they should be able to support a self-sustaining population. Passing the establishment filter, then we begin to ask questions about impact. So if a species can get there and if it will survive, are there likely to be adverse effects? And if the answer to all of those questions is yes, that site is likely to be vulnerable to an invasion of a particular species. So boiling this down a little bit further, introduction and establishment can be assumed to be a function of the probability of occurrence. So if something is likely to be introduced, it's likely to occur in a lake. If it is likely to survive, you're likely to see it there. And then in terms of impact for Eurasian water milfoil, we can talk about species abundance. So in which lakes is it going to be able to sustain a very large population that likely might have socioeconomic impacts, or will it sort of fly under the radar and be barely noticeable? So we're going to sort of separate this idea of site-specific vulnerability into two component pieces, the ones dealing with Eurasian water milfoil occurrence and the ones dealing with abundance. So we have two separate models that we can use to generate predictions for individual systems. So our first question is, where on the landscape is occurrence risk high? And using previously established research that demonstrates ecological and land use and human-related predictors, we can feed into a model a series of pieces of information about each individual lake, and then use a mathematical relationship to turn that understanding into what we're calling an occurrence risk, which is basically the probability that the species will be found in any given lake. And so that model takes presence-absence data, so where EWM is and where it isn't, and then it turns it into a continuous occurrence risk factor that ranges from 0 to 1. So the model that we have produced takes into account things like lake size, urban or agricultural land use, water chemistry in the form of conductivity or pH. We're looking also at distance to Eurasian water milfoil sources to reflect dispersal, also some climatic drivers that describe climate but also describe spatial variation. And we find that the modeled estimates, why they aren't completely accurate, they are demonstrably better than guessing at where the species is going to be. And consistent with some previous work looking at EWM occurrence, we find that human-related variables like road density in the buffer are important in predicting occurrence, as well as dispersal factors like distance to source, and water chemistry variables like surface area, pH and geology, and then also surface area. So these are some of the predictors that are being used significantly by the model to predict occurrence patterns. So the question now is, how do we use this data? So if we're looking at a mapping application, we need a way to turn this 0 to 1 occurrence risk into a tool that will be useful. And so to kind of get you sort of thinking about possibilities for how to use this information, I'll just step through a couple of sort of thought experiments, I guess. So here's one real-world example, and we have a theoretical group of lakes on the left represented by circles. And the question you might have is, okay, where do I monitor? Let's say I have one volunteer on this group of lakes that I'm responsible for. Where would I send that person? And so if we associate each lake with the predicted occurrence risk factor, we might sort of pull out some of these higher risk lakes as candidates for monitoring. If we pair that with information where the species already is, we can start to make decisions based on the occurrence risk. So if you had one monitor, maybe you would send them here, or perhaps here because it's close to an invasion. So is this one though. So anyways, this is kind of an example of how we might use the raw risk estimates that come directly from the model. Another example would be maybe to sort of make coarse risk categories from low, medium to high interpreted based on the probability that comes out of the model. So we could divide lakes into red, green, and yellow categories, for example. Another option would be to talk about confidence categories. Since there is some uncertainty in the model itself, we could, say, break lakes into two groups and associate a degree of confidence with respect to how likely it is that the species would be there. And then again, this is using the raw risk scores, but interpreting them a little bit in a way that might be useful. So we could divide lakes into those that maybe won't or maybe will have the species, or maybe those that we're quite sure won't, and then everything else, or another group, that we're quite sure will have the species and everything else. So anyways, those are just kind of some ideas of how we might use that information. And here's an example map that we produced from the model. And here, we've just sort of shown gray lakes, because there are 9,000, it's quite difficult to map that many, are those that are below a certain threshold of likelihood. So those that we would consider not as likely to have Eurasian water milfoil. Black would be where Eurasian water milfoil is present, and the colors then represent these occurrence risk categories that are, in this case, simply divided up into 3 equal groups. So we have like low, medium, and high. And then that produces also a list like this, which I think also might be useful for making decisions. So we have, our divided 3-category occurrence risk column there. So this, we have this information now for 8,630 uninvaded lakes in the state of Wisconsin, which is more information, I think, than we had previously. Okay, so now after we've covered the occurrence models, I'd like to briefly talk about the new stuff that we've done with respect to abundance. And I will say, just from the literature perspective, abundance models are quite less frequent in the literature. So I'm kind of excited that we can put this stuff together. So we're taking a pretty similar framework to the occurrence models, where for a much smaller set of lakes, so these would be the lakes on which we have abundance estimates, we can use variables that we think will control or predict abundance, and again produce a range of 0 to 1 estimate of predicted cover. You could translate this to 0 to 100% basically. So the model again gives us a continuous estimate of where we think abundance might be high. And in terms of, oops, sorry, this is a mistake. This is actually predicting EWM abundance. The take-homes from this part of the work is that abundance is much harder to predict. I mean, think of even in one lake, abundance varies over time due to temporal factors. But that said, the models that we produced are statistically significant, and about 26% of the observed variation that we see in Eurasian water milfoil abundance we can explain using the factors that we're considering. In particular, watershed percent agriculture is important, and slightly less important, percent urban, and then water clarity as reflected by the maximum depth of plant colonization. And then a couple of other factors control abundance variability, that of the percent of soft substrate, and again, we see agriculture. So I guess what I'd like to call your attention to here is my attempts to model Eurasian water milfoil abundance in the past have largely come up short. There was way too much variability in abundance estimates for them to really be useful. But the inclusion of this factor, the indicator species abundance factor, was really important for this model. So if we look back at some work that Stan Nichols did in the 90s, he looked at herbarium records and developed a series of species that tend to co-occur with Eurasian water milfoil more than would be expected by chance. And it turns out looking at the abundance of those indicator species is in fact a great way to predict the abundance of Eurasian water milfoil. So if we want to get an idea of how variable I'm talking about when I say our predictions are variable but statistically significant, here on the x-axis is what the model predicts for cover, and here on the y-axis is what we actually observe. And we see here this positive increasing line says, yes, there is a positive relationship between what we predict and what we actually see, which is good. It is statistically significant, and we're explaining about 26% of the observed variation. Also, this is the one-to-one line, so in a perfect world, we would predict exactly what we observed, and all the observations would fall here. So we see that there's a lot more variability, but the bias in the model is relatively low because the predictions remain relatively consistent with respect to that one-to-one line along the entire range. So just sort of thinking ahead to how we might use this information, we could say divide this predicted cover into groups, which again do have variability, but we would expect lower populations when our predicted cover is low, and we have a high chance for high abundance populations when our predicted cover is high. So again, we're sort of seeing a pattern. The model gives us this continuous variable predicted cover ranging from 0 to 1 or 0 to 100%. And the idea is to turn this into a tool that is useful for prioritizing management and prevention. So again, we could use the raw risk estimates. We could break them down into 3 or 4 or 5 or however many categories. And then we could also consider making categories that have a degree of uncertainty associated with them, among other things. Here's an example of how an abundance prediction map might look. Black, we have lakes that have EWM populations already, and then we have a simple 3-category division of abundance risk category. And now we can add to our table this idea of abundance risk as a column. And remember, we need abundance estimates, and the abundance of indicator species was very important for the model. So unfortunately, we only have predictions for abundance on 269 Eurasian water milfoil lakes. So we have occurrence and we have abundance, and we now can consider maybe combining them to understand overall vulnerability. So we have a list of lakes with an occurrence risk and an abundance risk associated with them. And we could explore ways of making overarching prioritization tiers. So for example, we might create what I'm calling this vulnerability matrix with a count of lakes that are high risk for both having Eurasian water milfoil and having high population of Eurasian water milfoil. And these might be considered your highest priority lakes. But maybe you want to define this to include some of that uncertainty. So maybe medium risk for abundance is considered also tier 1. And even if there's a medium risk of occurrence that a lake could attain high abundance might warrant tier 1 prioritization as well. So it's just kind of a one possible world of how we could combine this information. Okay, so to wrap up a little bit here, so we're thinking about applications to both prevention and management. So prevention, it would make sense to send monitors, for example, to prevent new invasions. It would make sense to send monitors to lakes with high occurrence risk. If resources in a particular region are extremely limited, though, it would make sense to not only target those with high occurrence, but if you need to choose a subset within that group, it would make sense to target those with high occurrence and high abundance, lakes that are going to be more vulnerable to Eurasian water milfoil. Now, in terms of management applications, the abundance, I think, has particular relevance because it might rationalize a more active response or more active monitoring when abundance risk is high. relative to where abundance risk is low. In those situations, you might be able to take a wait and see or a wait and monitor approach. That said, there also could be utility in identifying hotspots for occurrence and abundance in the state. So here's kind of an example of, if we use that vulnerability matrix, we can produce sort of a statewide management priority that considers both occurrence and abundance on the landscape for a subset of lakes. And I don't know if most of you are familiar with the web portal that we're considering putting this work on or not, but this is the AIS smartprevention.wisc.edu site. This actually goes to a gateway, and you'll have to click through a couple of screens to get here. But this is an online mapping tool where you can select a species. I think the options currently are goby, zebra mussels, rusty crayfish, and smelt. And we will add, I think, Eurasian water milfoil. And, here we have sort of a category breakdown that's suitable, borderline suitable, not suitable, or data not available. But those are some of the options that occur currently, but we can explore other features as well. So that said, I would love to hear some feedback on the work that we've done and how you might think it would be useful or how you would like to interact with the information as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Allie. So yeah, I guess Allie has several questions up on the screen, and feel free to chime in with some answers. I don't know, Allie, if you had a specific message for moderating this Q&A or this discussion.
Which I guess is not a bad thing, but.
So everyone, I've unmuted you to ask some questions that might make it a little bit easier than typing things into the chat. So you can either remute yourself if you don't have anything to ask, or just chime in.
But I don't know. I'm curious to see how effective it will be, because a lot of that staff needs to retire. Are 5 to 7 years away from that.
Hello?
Yeah, I think that was somebody not paying or not talking about Eurasian water milfoil.
Didn't sound like it.
Yeah.
Good job, Tim. This is Eric. I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
How could we use this, for example, to compare those high-risk lakes to the mix of lakes that currently get funding for Clean Boat, Clean Waters efforts? And could we use that also then to basically see gaps in our coverage and try to prioritize Clean Boat, Clean Water funding towards higher risk lakes?
I think that is a fantastic use of the information. I would be happy to take that information and look at the crosswalk as well, or hand it off to somebody else too. We're thinking about pushing forward to publication soon, so we should be able to do those kinds of analyses, I think relatively shortly. So yeah, identifying gaps in current coverage would be fantastic. I guess I have one follow-up. What do you think about the relative use of the occurrence information and the abundance information, or do you like that kind of summing it all together and producing statewide priorities that consider both factors at once?
I mean, for me, I guess it depends on the actual user, because the lakes that are thinking about going into more of a management or dealing with Eurasian water milfoil mode, that's one thing, versus, again, the effort put into prevention and intercepting people at the boat landings, trying to keep it from getting into a lake. So I think, I don't know, for me it would relate directly to what you're going to use the data for.
Okay, so that sounds like you would like to interact with both pieces of information, maybe separately and together. So you think you can see applications for all three ways of doing it: just occurrence, just abundance, and then like the summed priority.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other feedback for Allie? Feel free to chime in.
This is Madeline. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. This is Madeline Roberts. I'm not directly involved with a lot of management stuff, but I think that some of our managers, I guess I shouldn't speak for them, but I think it would be helpful to have the numbers too, besides doing the categories, just so they can see, like, well, if it's high, how high is it, and that sort of thing, or is it kind of on that edge, and maybe they can make, I would like that if I was managing it, to make some of those decisions besides just having the color gradients. So I don't, if I think something might be a little higher risk or maybe more important if it's on that bubble, I can include that instead of saying, well, that's just medium or low priority, so I'm just going to drop it. Just my 2 cents, I guess.
Yeah, thanks for that feedback. So you'd like the raw numbers. What if I told you that the relationship between the 0 to 1 probability and how it affects the accuracy of our predictions isn't necessarily linear? Does that make it a little bit more complicated?
Yeah, it does. So maybe knowing more about the models would help too. Because I guess I like the application of the colors, but sometimes I worry that, at least when I'm looking at stuff like that, that you never know, like you said, like the accuracy and how those relationships work. So you might be making choices just based on the colors you're seeing more than knowing more about the data and how the model was used.
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
There's Jeannie. I got a question with the when you're actually in the prevention tool, look at the information, are you able, is that so that you can zoom in and see what lake you're actually looking at versus a static map that shows colors all over, and you can, unless you're super familiar, you can't always tell what the lakes are. And my other question was, well, for one thing, I think it could be helpful on a number of levels, including when regions have to choose their directed lakes that they're going to go out and see. Would be one more way to consider how vulnerable they are. Get yourself out there and take a look if you haven't been able to go to a particular water body. But I was wondering, when we collect data for those programs and any others, is this hooked up in a way to SWIMS that it gets that information, or do you have to have the spreadsheets like from a PI or AS survey to upload all that yourselves into this?
Allie, you might be on mute. We don't hear your answer.
I am on mute. Thank you.
I thought I scared you away with all my questions.
Shoot. No, I was just talking up a storm. Thanks, Jeannie, for your suggestion to use it for directed lakes monitoring. I think that's a great one that I hadn't yet considered. In terms of your other questions, yes, zooming is a thing. Sort of showing on this smart prevention site, you can sort of zoom into whatever level you'd like. So yes, zoomable. Yes, for directed lakes. Why am I blanking on your?
I was wondering how the data gets fed into it. If it's hooked up
SWIMS.
to
Yeah, SWIMS. Yeah. Yes. So the occurrence estimates will be available for all lakes immediately. The abundance estimates do require a PI survey. So to get more than our current, I think we have 657 lakes that have been surveyed that we have estimates for. A lot of those do have milfoil, so I think we're talking, the high 200s in terms of abundance estimates. So anytime we produce a new PI, we could update with that information. We don't have any plans yet to put the information into SWIMS, but maybe we could explore developing a tool that is integrated into sort of our future lake data report that would, if there's a PI survey, sort of estimate Eurasian water milfoil abundance using the information that we have on those indicator species and then the other information. So no plans for swims yet, but we could think about doing that for new data. Yeah.
Can I speak to that a little? This is Maureen. That's been a dream for a while to incorporate like the zebra mussel suitability stuff and then what Allie's doing into the swims layers, but it's just another thing that we have to do. But yeah, I think that's something that can happen. And we did incorporate the suitability into the directed lakes selection. It should be one of the columns as well as our early detection selections. It's really a great...
Oh, that came from this?
Yep.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. Cool.
Yeah.
So a question from the chat for you, Allie. When do we expect this modeling data, I think the smart prevention tool, to be available for us to play around with? Because it sounds like there might be some interest in just picking out a few, I guess, high-risk lakes to survey this summer and just see, I guess, how the prediction and the actual survey compare.
Oh, interesting. Great. Thanks. So I would like to vet this through peer review channels, which take forever. And so I'm thinking, fall or winter for the sort of quote-unquote final results. However, that said, I would be more than willing to work with individuals who are interested in, sort of trying out, what their expectations are with respect to a list of lakes that I can provide them for the region with preliminary results. If that's of interest, I would encourage you to contact me via email, and we can start having a conversation about it.
Hey, Allie, this is Jeremy.
Any other questions for Allie or feedback?
Hey, this is Jeremy. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Hey, as far as the abundance factor, I mean, that's a predictor of how abundant the milfoil could be in the system, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, a relatively coarse one. So it would be the littoral cover in a given lake. So morphometry is still going to come into play for sure, and some other natural features. Yep.
So do you recommend at this point, or is it too early to use this to guide management decisions if we do discover a new lake with milfoil in it and it's at a earlier pioneer stage? Does that factor, would that guide us or warrant us using a more aggressive approach or less aggressive approach to management and control?
Great. I think I would love to fully vet the work first, so subjecting it to peer review, et cetera. That said, the kind of peer review that will come in the places I'm going to be submitting it is not going to have the same kind of expertise that people in management circles do. So I'd like to sort of simultaneously explore opportunities for management implications, sort of provisionally at first. And then if it turns out that it seems to be working okay, I think that would be a fantastic use of the information. With the requisite and concomitant acknowledgement of the fact that the models that we're producing estimates that they have error associated with them for sure. But yeah, once peer review is completed, I think that would be a great way to approach at least arguing for a more conservative management approach.
Thank you. Yeah, I meant both sides of the house, both conservative or aggressive. But yeah, definitely for conservative.
So Allie, this is Tim. It seems like some other invasive species management programs or efforts like the Invasive Species Archive that Jason Granberg's been putting together, and I think some of the work that Mark Renz's lab has been doing has helped create lists for counties of priority areas to monitor or go check things out at. And we're housing some of that stuff on, I think, or hoping to, on a county-by-county basis on our Invasive Species Partnership Box account. How easy would it be to take all of the lakes in the county and just have a spreadsheet that has their abundance risk and presence risk just in a spreadsheet? Because I really like the viewer, but I also see having it in a spreadsheet would be useful too. So sorry, all put together.
Allie, you might be
Yeah,
on mute.
yes. Sorry, I am. Sorry, I keep pressing the button. Yeah, so this is the sort of preliminary spreadsheet that we have, and I agree with you. I think lists are extraordinarily helpful because sometimes navigating through a viewer is kind of a pain, and you really just want to sort by priority within your region. So I think extraordinarily easy. It's much easier to do this than make a map for sure.
Okay. Well, if you get to a point when you feel comfortable sharing this, you can get in touch with me, and I can plug it into our AIS coordinator network.
Sounds great, Tim. Thanks.
Allie, this is Bob. Thanks for the presentation. I think this is really kind of exciting stuff. A couple of questions. How much of the information that goes into the model is species specific? And two, how applicable do you think it would be to other invasive plants, either floating or rooted?
That's a great question. So for one, the question of whether or not the information that goes into these models is species specific, and the answer is yes, definitely. So in terms of extending these findings to cover other invasive species, I don't think that that's a reasonable application. As far as other plants, more applicability there, but I think to produce abundance estimates for sure requires a pretty detailed knowledge of the species life history and its demonstrated abundance patterns in the field, because there is so much variability. I think the cross-species applications in this case are relatively limited. I think it's a good idea to try to produce this kind of work for additional species of concern. So it would be nice to know, sort of where we should head next. Starry stonewort, for example, if that's something we need to be producing occurrence and abundance models for. We have limited information at our fingertips now, but we could work with other states to develop a better understanding of the drivers of occurrence and abundance.
So you kind of have to have it in order to model it.
To model it well, yes. We can produce estimates for almost anything, but whether or not they're going to reflect reality and to what degree they reflect reality depends on the quality of the information going in.
Thank you. Good work.
Allie, this is Kathy Higley with Vilas County Land and Water. I just wanted to make a comment kind of building off of Bob's question with the being species specific. And I think there was a question earlier about how this could potentially impact Clean Boats, Clean Waters grants and so forth. And just the idea that there's more out there than Eurasian water milfoil when it comes to Clean Boats, Clean Waters and educating users on AIS prevention. That was just one thought that came to mind. So I think that to limit perhaps grant funding for lakes that may have occurrence or abundance for Eurasian water milfoil might be missing a few other species. But then also I wanted to ask too, you had alluded that there was a certain complex of species that were associated with abundant Eurasian water milfoil. And I was hoping you might be able to elaborate a little bit on that. I'm not real familiar with that, and I would love to get a little bit more info if you can condense it into maybe a couple sentences.
Sure thing. I think that your comments with respect to making decisions based on one species are incredibly apt. I think the more species that we can develop, a better understanding for, the better. And, the more species we understand, the more we can start to identify, multi-species invasion hotspots. And some of the work I think Jason Granberg is doing is really sort of targeted to, that introduction and dispersal part of the model as opposed to the species-specific environmental suitability part. Second, in terms of the species predictions, Stan Nichols looked at herbarium records that sort of were, I think, covered most of the state of Wisconsin, and he looked for lakes that had populations of Eurasian water milfoil that had vouchers associated with them, as well as other native species. And he found that plants like Heteranthera dubia, Potamogeton illinoisensis, it's escaping me, I think maybe Potamogeton zostriformis. Basically, there's a whole list of species that are native species that are ranked in terms of the strength of their association with Eurasian water milfoil. And Nichols was looking more at occurrence, right? So, you know, if Potamogeton illinoisensis occurs in a lake, it might be more likely that Eurasian water milfoil is there too. This work kind of takes that finding of co-occurrence patterns and develops a relationship between shared abundance patterns. So when we find these indicator species in lakes, not only do we find Eurasian water milfoil there more often than would be expected by chance, but the abundances of the indicator species and Eurasian water milfoil are typically correlated. So if the abundance of those indicator species are high, often Eurasian water milfoil abundance will be high as well. And that kind of, you know, speaks back to that ecological understanding with respect to Eurasian water milfoil being a matrix dominant that coexists with other species. And the work that we've done with the cure disease question, kind of seeing that actually a lot of the shared coefficients that describe the abundance patterns for multiple species are positive. So plants, macrophytes are responding to environmental conditions kind of together, as opposed to being a community that's defined by striving and competition. So it seems as though environmental filtering or environmental suitability is more important than you know, sort of necessarily one species outcompeting the other in terms of explaining patterns in abundance.
Okay, so it's more than just, you know, you have a few of these species you might want to be watching out. It's definitely more complex than that. So just wanted to make sure I was following.
Yeah, it's complex, but it's also simple. So if the species is there, the chances of having Eurasian water milfoil are a little bit higher. If the species is abundant, the chances of having abundant EWM are a little bit higher. So I guess that was a lot of information because I think it's kind of cool, and I admittedly am sort of an ecology geek, but yeah, it's also not as complicated as it seems. You know what I mean?
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Hey, Allie, this is Scott. Can you hear me?
Hi, Scott.
Hi. Thanks for presenting again. This is really cool stuff. I just have maybe some thoughts about the abundance model and a question. You know, I guess I like the idea of maybe putting it into it's like two categories, like extremely likely to be abundant and maybe not so much. I just, you know, I guess the model explains like 26% of the variability. And if you look at that line, like there's a lot of points above and below the line. So I guess I struggle, and I guess I just like your thoughts. I mean, do you think that would be useful in, you know, directing how much management should happen in a lake with the model as it is now? So that's one question. And since you do have a lot of variability in the scatter of those points, I guess I'm also wondering, are there other things that you didn't have data for in your model that might help explain the abundance better, that are things that we could start thinking about collecting to improve the model?
Those are really great questions. In terms of the use for management, again, I'd like to sort of provisionally say, yes, I think it could be useful. And I think your intuition to make broad categories is a really good one, because we know that within a given lake, temporal variability can be very high, which probably explains a lot of the scatter that we're seeing at the higher end of the scale. In our 10-year Eurasian water milfoil study, you know, we've seen kind of cycles, or maybe not cycles, but more stochasticity, where Eurasian water milfoil increases and decreases by, you know, 20 percentage points one year, and then it goes back up. And so sort of good years and bad years seem more the rule than the norm. So acknowledging that there is a large amount of scatter around the plots, I do think that the model is useful if you kind of take it with a grain of salt and see it as relatively a coarse representation of what could possibly be a lake's future. So you're definitely not saying, yes, it's going to be high here, but there is a larger variability on the second part of that line. So I think dividing maybe into two categories is a really good intuition. Sort of, we have evidence that it's probably not going to get above a certain point as a, to define a threshold, or say, of lakes below this predicted cover, only 90% have populations above 20%, for example. So inserting some uncertainty in the categorization, I think, might help. Sort of my philosophical perspective is, maybe we sort of provisionally use it and see, if it ends up causing problems because of the variability, then we maybe would scale back. But I also think it's better than not knowing anything at all. So there is truth in that information, even though it's not 100% predictable. And then in terms of your second question, with respect to data, management information would be important probably to include here. It's very difficult to insert that information into the model because of tracking and variations in morphometry and size and the way treatments are applied and whether or not they're actually targeting Eurasian water milfoil. So that's one big oops in terms of not having appropriately accounted for things. As far as some of the other things go, I'd really have to sit and do a little bit of brainstorming and probably some reading in terms of thinking of other factors to study or monitor to improve the model. But I will do that. Thank you for your suggestion.
Thanks.
Hey, Ellie, I have a question. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, good. I think Scott asked a good question. It triggered some thoughts. So I know you surveyed around 450 lakes to develop this model. How many, I'm using the PI surveys for several years. So we have species, these prohibited species that aren't yet widely established in the state. But to develop models for those, how many PI surveys with lakes with those species would you need to have? Is 6 or 7 enough, or would you have to have 50? Do you know what I'm asking? So we know we have X number of lakes, like with Starry Stonewort, and we've done PIs on all those. Can you use those PIs? Yeah.
Yeah. Are you talking occurrence or abundance? Or both?
Both.
Yeah, so occurrence is easier to do that with limited amounts of data. There are some fancy statistical packages that perform relatively well with a small number of occurrences. So we could produce occurrence estimates. I've seen stuff in the literature. I don't love it when sample sizes are super low, but with 15 to 20 species, there are some corrections that you could do for super rare species, because modeling rare species is of a great interest to a lot of people. So there are techniques to do that. Abundance is a bit more difficult. It helps if you can cover the full observed range of abundance that you see. But there are also opportunities to use information that's been collected elsewhere. So if we can partner, with IPAIN or people on the eastern seaboard that have abundance estimates, we can produce estimates for some of the species that have not yet entered our range. There are a series of other caveats. Sometimes in new areas, invasive species perform very differently, but again, some estimates are sometimes better than none.
That's good to know, and that's kind of what I expected you would say. So your model used the PI data, but would it only accept data that's collected through the PI to look at the abundance? Because if it's collected using a different method, if somebody did a transect survey, which is going to be less thorough, but does the method still have to be the same for how the data was collected?
Right. So usually the choice of, sort of the statistical armature that you apply to answer this kind of abundance question depends, the form of the data that you're putting into the model changes kind of the assumptions that you're making in doing the modeling. So any estimate of percent cover would be helpful because it follows the same kinds of mathematical rules. Something like biomass, you would have to use a different model for. But that said, the conceptual framework of trying to understand variation in abundance, however it's captured, and then using predictors to to estimate what it's likely to be holds. So you can use whatever model is appropriate for the data you have. The problem does come in combining abundance estimates that are very different and perform differently. So you wouldn't have to, I don't think that you would have to do sort of like strict, well, I mean, that said, it's always better if you can have methodological consistency. But I guess, sort of long story short, there are options to use other models for other kinds of abundance measures.
Thank you, Allie.
Hey, Allie, this is Jeremy again.
Hi.
Did you include like hybrid data with this model? And if not, could we loosely apply this model in decisions for hybrid milfoil, do you think?
In this model, hybrid and Eurasian water milfoil are lumped, and I didn't explore any of the predictions with respect to predicting hybridity. The information that I would sort of point you to answer that question would be the stuff that is coming out of, I think, Ryan Thum and some other folks in Michigan, I believe, where they're looking at predictors of hybridity and actually finding that factors we didn't consider in this work to be very important, like the history of 2,4-D treatment, et cetera.
Okay, so like as we apply this likelihood of occurrence, like we could say that if it's somewhat interchangeable with likelihood of occurrence of hybrid too, since they were all lumped together, or is that too bold?
Yeah, until we have information that says the ecological preferences of hybrid are very different from Eurasian water milfoil, we can't necessarily say that the model doesn't apply, because most of the stuff that I've seen, you know, it sort of tends to follow the same kinds of preferences. So I think and it moves probably the same way as well through, you know, boaters. So being so similar, you know, I don't think it's a non-interesting question. There might be some ecological preferences that are markedly different between the two species, but we don't have any scientific information to support that that's true yet. So I would say, yeah, you can kind of use them to predict like this general Eurasian water milfoil genetic group.
Any last feedback for Allie? Allie, I guess, oh, sorry, there was an echo on our end. I'm interested in, what is your sort of ultimate vision for this tool? Like, if you could have this be the most useful thing ever to people doing this work, what's your vision for that?
I really, the sort of low-hanging fruit, I think, is exactly what Eric brought up in the very beginning, that it is used in a way that helps us prioritize prevention efforts, because we've shown time and again that, you know, prevention is the best way to handle invasive species. Once they get into the system, they're very difficult to get out, and control options are, you know, sort of marginally successful. So I think
stupid ants. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was muted. Smashing an ant on my calendar.
That was hilarious. Thanks. Yeah, so I think it would be used to kind of make funding decisions about where we support monitoring and prevention activities. And I can, you know, see that as just being a list, a priority list, as well as I can see that being sort of a mapped tool. I do like the geographical information, because then you can start to, you know, introduce some of your own concerns about like efficiency of monitoring in the field, for example, or, you know, if you want to sort of regionally target an area that makes sense that has a lot of high-risk lakes, for example. So I think both pieces are important, but sort of my first recommendation would be to sort of combine this idea of occurrence and abundance to really pick out the high priority monitoring targets.
Great, thanks, Allie. And if folks have, you know, if they're sitting with this information and they have some more feedback for you, what's the best way for them to relay that to you?
I'd love to get emails. but you can feel free to call me too.
Cool. Well, any last words from the audience before we sign off? Sounds like no, but thank you everyone for joining us. And again, if you have more feedback for Allie or you want to have a conversation with her, feel free to get in contact with her. If you don't have her information, I guess contact Tim or I, or we can send out her information to the group. And yeah, thanks Allie so much.